Mi gente bonita, ¿cómo están? Bienvenidos a un nuevo video. El día de hoy quiero que me acompañen a escuchar este discurso que tiene este estadounidense para los suyos, para otros estadounidenses que viven en México. Y es que ya sabemos que hay muchos extranjeros viviendo allí en México en diferentes áreas de diferentes partes del mundo también. Así que uno se queda como, ¿cómo es posible que se hablen tantas cosas de México, pero que al mismo tiempo la gente ame tanto las tierras mexicanas, su comida, su gente, su servicio, sus paisajes? Curioso, ¿verdad? Así que acompáñenme a ver este mensaje. Va a estar en inglés porque es un mensaje que él le quiere dar a sus compatriotas estadounidenses. Él normalmente crea contenido en español, pero en esta oportunidad lo quiso hacer en inglés. De todas formas, tiene los subtítulos en español para que podamos también entender. ¿Listo? Así que vamos a escucharlo y como siempre les dejaré aquí en la descripción el video original para que vayan y dejen su apoyo, al igual que dejen su amor por acá, mijos, con ese like, suscríbanse al canal, activen la campanita. Nos vemos en mis otras redes sociales. Sin más, nos fuimos. ¡Ay! Listo.
Hola, banda.
Hola, banda.
Este video va a estar en inglés, porque a diferencia de todos mis otros contenidos, la audiencia destinataria aquí son los gringos en México.
Los gringos.
Pero puse subtítulos en español para mis seguidores regulares. This video is for all the other Americans living in Mexico, all 1.6 million of us. We've come here for different reasons, but from the digital nomads in La Condesa to the retirees in San Miguel de Allende, we all have one thing in common. The economic conditions in our home country are less favorable to us than the economic conditions in Mexico.
Las condiciones económicas son menos favorables para ellos en este país. No todo el mundo tiene dinero en Estados Unidos como la gente cree. Acá también hay diferentes estatus sociales. Y la gente que tiene un estatus social bajo acá o medianamente ahí como en la mitad, pues sufre de los cambios de la economía y su dinero rinde más en nuestros países.
You've probably seen the videos recruiting people to come live in Mexico with titles like Earn Dollars and Spend in Pesos. As members of the Imperial Core, our labor is rewarded at a higher rate than the members of the periphery. Some Americans think that this extra acquisitive power means they have extra rights. This video is to explain why that's not true. I'll start with a little of my own story. I grew up in New York. The Big Apple, baby. But when I became an adult, I realized how hard it was to afford to live there. The lowest rent I ever had was $500, and this was back in 2010. It was for a one-room apartment with no window and a shared bathroom across the hall. This was on 127th Street and Park Avenue, right next to the Metro North Station, which had trains coming in at all hours of the day and night. I had no heat or air conditioning, and every time I tried to cook in my toaster oven, I blew a circuit breaker. There was a local gang in front that sold crack 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, even in the snowstorms. But even that godforsaken hovel wouldn't be available today for less than $2,000.
Ay, vean ustedes, él cuenta que vivía en Nueva York y que la renta más económica que logró llegar a tener fueron de $500 y aún así en condiciones en un cuarto súper pequeño, sin ventana, sin aire acondicionado, sin una cocina decente, y aún así él veía como enfrente pues vendían drogas y tenía aparte de eso una estación de tren cerca. Entonces imagínense el ruido. Yo por mi lado les cuento que en el apartamento en el que vivo, obviamente rento, no es mío. Es un apartamento de una habitación, nada más. Y una renta aquí en la zona en la que yo vivo, que es una zona normal, digamos que no se puede decir que es un barrio súper malo ni un barrio súper bueno, es un barrio normal. Mínimo, una renta así de una habitación, 1,300, 1,400, aparte de lo que hay que pagar de depósito y de la persona que le renta a uno, que es el broker, le llaman acá, que es una renta completa, ¿no? Ya habíamos hablado de ese tema de cuánto se necesita para poderse mudar en un apartamento acá, son alrededor de $6,000, con lo que hay que dejar de las rentas que hay que pagar por adelantado, el depósito y lo que se le paga a la persona que le renta a uno al broker. Hay un video por acá en mi contenido propio donde les cuento qué tan costoso es rentar acá en Nueva Jersey por si quieren ir a chismosearlo, pero es una realidad, es realmente caro.
The rental market was always going up, but in the last decade, it's ballooned to something that most working people simply can't afford. And it's not just the case in New York, too. You could say the same about any number of US cities. In my conversations with other foreigners here in Mexico, that increase in prices is a common factor in the decision to move. When I came to Mexico in 2015, I moved to Cuernavaca, where I found a job teaching English. I quickly found an apartment just a block from my job. Now, I was only making 90 pesos an hour, but the rent at this apartment was only 2,200 pesos a month. At the time, the equivalent of about $130. Now, this apartment had multiple windows. It even had a little garden. And best of all, it had a private bathroom. My boss recommended that I get some extra work teaching online. That way I could make dollars. She was doing it, and so were most of my other coworkers. So I found a job making $10 an hour online for giving classes to people in Saudi Arabia. $10 an hour is really not good money in New York, but in Mexico, that goes pretty far. My original plan was just to stay in Mexico for a few months, because I was waiting to hear back from the FDNY Academy. I had done my EMT certification a year before, and so I thought, I'll go to Mexico for a few months, brush up on my Spanish, and when they email me, I'll come back and become an EMT for the fire department of New York.
Oh, ya entendí su historia. Él se fue a México por unos meses para aprender mejor el español y pues de paso estaba siendo maestro, estaba enseñando porque quería entrar a el Fire Department de New York, al departamento de bomberos de Nueva York y ser técnico de emergencias. Ah, interesante.
But when I got the email confirming my space in the class of 2016, I rejected it. I realized that my life in Mexico as a teacher was far better than trying to make it in New York as a paramedic. In other words, and this is really important, the labor opportunities in my home city and home country did not provide a stable pathway to a better future. I wanted a decent apartment. I wanted to have a long-term relationship, maybe even a marriage, maybe even have some kids, and I didn't see that as possible living in New York. But living here in Mexico, it was.
Vean cómo él se visualizaba inclusive en su futuro para tener una familia, para tener una vida más digna, un mejor lugar de vivienda, hijos inclusive. Acá la vida va tan rápido que ustedes se sorprenderían de la cantidad de personas solteras que no pueden conseguir una pareja, primero porque no tienen el tiempo de socializar y segundo porque no tienen la estabilidad económica. Es una realidad.
This wasn't the case just a generation ago in the United States. My dad was a union stagehand for 40 years. He managed to provide well for his family with just that job, but at the cost of 60 to 80-hour work weeks, working every weekend, even working Christmas. He also wound up with both of his knees replaced and this mold in his lungs that they say all of the stagehands who work in the ceilings and walls of Broadway theaters get. But hey, at least he has union health insurance. Those few remaining union jobs, like the one he had, are disappearing. Union work and decently paid work in general has been disappearing since the 1980s, when they closed all of the factories in the Midwest and Ronald Reagan fired all of the air traffic controllers. People my age are expected to embrace the gig economy, which is serfdom. You never get a raise, you never get a bonus, you don't get paid days off, you don't get a pension. All of those things that workers in previous generations fought for, those are gone. How are we expected to find a future for ourselves? But as our labor rights and our collective bargaining power have faded away to become a thing of the past, a new digital frontier has emerged. You can work remotely. You don't need to live in the imperial core and pay imperial core prices to get an imperial core salary. All you need is a computer, the internet, and the right documents. Especially with the increase in work from home opportunities as a result of COVID, more and more Americans are deciding to look exclusively for opportunities where they can work from home and then change where that home is so they can afford to live. As for the retirees, well, they already made their money. But then inflation came and took away the little bit of acquisitive power they thought they would have in their golden years. People who dreamed for decades of buying a little house in the country get to that point and discover that they don't have enough for a shack. But then they hear about San Miguel de Allende or Chapala or Ajijic or any of another dozen gringo enclaves and say, ooh, maybe I could get something there. There's realtors who speak English, and they're happy to help them convert their dollars into pesos.
Vean ustedes este fenómeno que está sucediendo acá. Y es que, claro, la inflación y la situación económica para muchas personas que viven acá, pues les ha afectado. Por ejemplo, si una persona ya es profesional y ha escalado sus años de experiencia, pues gana un poquito más que el promedio. Pero si la inflación sube, pues entonces ese mismo dinero que esa persona ganaba ya no le alcanza para lo mismo o no le alcanza para tener ese poder adquisitivo un poquito más alto que el de los demás, porque el valor de la hora mínimo también sube. Entonces ese espacio, esa diferencia, pues se va disminuyendo y eso permite que eso más bien no les permite a las personas que se suponía que tenían una mejor estabilidad económica de resaltar o de tener ese dinero que ellos creían que tenían, es lo que explica él. Por ejemplo, la gente que tiene mucho dinero ahorrado porque eso fue lo que hizo toda su vida o tiene su retiro, su pensión, lo que sea, pues en realidad no les vale y no les se alcanza, no les sirve para lo que creían y pues a veces ni siquiera comprar una casa acá y ahorita menos, porque como todas las personas se han estado mudando de las ciudades donde hay mucho movimiento, como por ejemplo en Nueva York, que justamente en el momento de la pandemia la gente se empezó a dar cuenta de que vivían en apartamentos súper pequeños que no podían ni respirar ni caminar. Entonces empezaron a comprar casas en Nueva Jersey, por ejemplo, que está ahí al lado. Y claro, la demanda de casas es tan alta, pero la oferta tan poca que pues las casas suben su valor y la gente dice, oiga, no, ya no me puedo ni comprar una casa que era lo que creía que podía. Y al hacer la traducción en pesos mexicanos, en estos paraísos hermosos, divinos, con una calidad de vida mejor, una comida más rica, un ambiente más tranquilo, pues claro, ¿cómo no se van a mudar?
So here's what the retirees and the digital nomads just don't seem to understand. That this action, bringing your dollars to Mexico, is not a benevolent one. You are not helping the economy, you are helping yourself. Your own country's economy and markets do not exist to help working or retired people. They exist to exploit those people. So, in seeking refuge from that exploitation, you come to Mexico and decide to start a new life here. Now, back home, what do we call the exploited people who cross our borders looking for better economic opportunities? We certainly don't call them digital nomads or expats or any of the other cringeworthy names that Americans only call themselves. Those people are immigrants, and you and I here in Mexico, we are immigrants. When you go to get your documents, which I hope you will do and not just be illegal here forever, you're not going to go to the Expat Institute. You're going to go to the Instituto Nacional de Migración. It's right there in the name. No matter where you're...
Esperen porque yo no lo supero. Él dice... Los estadounidenses a las personas que cruzan las fronteras para buscar una mejor vida, una mejor calidad de vida, les llaman los inmigrantes, ¿verdad? Entonces le dice a sus compatriotas estadounidenses, no crean que ustedes viniendo a México a traer su dinero en dólares, no crean que está haciendo algo bueno, ni que les está ayudando a ustedes a la economía de México. Es todo lo contrario, eso lo que hace es subir los precios de todo. Pero no solo eso, No crean que ustedes aquí están siendo los nómadas digitales o los expatriados que se llaman como de una manera más sutil, sino que ustedes también son inmigrantes. Eso que tanto ustedes nombran y señalan a los que quieren buscar de una mejor calidad de vida en su país, pues se están convirtiendo en lo mismo. O sea, sean conscientes de que inclusive el Instituto de Inmigración lo tiene en el nombre. Me pareció muy curioso.
From the U.S., you've met immigrants. You might even be the child of immigrants. My great-grandparents came to the U.S. at the beginning of the 20th century. They were fleeing from the pogroms in Europe and had heard about the streets paved with gold in New York. Of course, the streets at that time didn't have any gold. Lots of horse poop, though. We're familiar with the story of immigration. It's been told in countless movies and books, and it's always an inspiring story about the opportunities in America. Somebody arrives with nothing. They don't even speak the language, but they get a job, and they work hard, and they learn English, and they stop speaking their foreign language, and then their kids are able to get a little slice of that American dream. At least that's how it was supposed to work. But now, in the 21st century, the new wave of immigrants like me aren't dependent on the local job opportunities. We're also not forced to learn the language. In fact, it's quite the opposite because most of our online jobs are conducted entirely in our first language. In my case, I used my first language as a job. Such is the power of English as an imperial language. I think a lot of this attitude that Americans have, that everyone else should speak English, comes from the fact that we're used to being tourists. Now, tourists aren't expected to learn the local language. If you're going to Cancun for a week, why would you bother putting in all of the hours you need to learn Spanish? Everyone at your hotel is going to speak English anyway. We see this back in our home country too. Whichever city you're from, I'm sure you've seen big groups of Chinese tourists who only know hello and thank you. They stick together so they can speak Chinese with their friends. It's what a lot of Americans do here. That's fine. The problem is, if you're living here, you're no longer a tourist. You're no longer at a hotel on the beach in Cancun with all those friendly English-speaking employees. No, the people around you have no reason to speak English, and you have no reason to keep trying to speak English to them. Honestly, you couldn't have a better country to be learning a second language in. Mexicans are super patient with people learning Spanish. My first 2 years, I tripped over pronunciations, I said the wrong word, I invented grammatical structures out of thin air, and people listened to me and did their best to understand. Nobody ever screamed at me, "Go back to your country," or "Learn to speak well," the way that white Americans do to immigrants back home. Now,
y no solo les dicen devuélvanse a su país, go back to Mexico, sino if you are here in America, you have to speak American language. A veces ni siquiera saben que su idioma se llama inglés, el idioma no se llama americano. Eso es como cuando, es como si yo dijera, es que en Colombia hablamos colombiano, ¿no? ¿Verdad? En Colombia hablamos español. Pues la gente a veces ni siquiera sabe que, ¿cómo se llama su idioma? O sea, no inventen. Bueno, continuemos.
people down here understand that it takes time to learn a language, and they respect it. You can show your respect by trying. Even if your pronunciation isn't great, just a modicum of effort will go a long way. But Spanish is just the beginning. As an American in Mexico, there's something even more important you need to learn, and that's the history of U.S. interventions in Mexico. You might have guessed from the name of my YouTube channel, IntervencionesGringas, but this is what I study. This is what I make content about in Spanish. The history of U.S. empire building in Latin American countries. And they never say, we're invading Panama because we want a canal, or we're invading Honduras because we want the bananas. No, it's always more clever than that. They always use us, the American citizens living in that country. The phrase that they've been repeating since the 1850s is, we must protect the lives and property of American citizens.
General Noriega's reckless threats and attacks upon Americans in Panama created an imminent danger to the 35,000 American citizens in Panama. As president, I have no higher obligation than to safeguard the lives of American citizens.
Ay, no, esperen, porque esta sí no me la sabía yo. O sea, yo siempre he escuchado que sí, las invasiones, que porque supuestamente tienen que intervenir para ayudar a la democracia, la paz y todo este tema, pero no había escuchado esa otra excusa que veo que sí también muy importante, que es, para la protección de los estadounidenses que viven en los otros países, como en este caso, por ejemplo, México, o en ese caso, por ejemplo, el canal de Panamá. Bueno, el que querían el canal y que estaba en Panamá. Wow.
Remember, because maybe you moved in and you told your Mexican neighbor, hey, I'm a US citizen, and he gave you a strange look and you thought, why doesn't he like Americans? Well, historically, Americans moving into your Latin American country has meant that an invasion is coming soon. You should also think about how many Mexicans have family members living and working in the United States, and just how different the immigrant experience is when you go north instead of south. If you're up there without official documents, then you have to keep your head down at all times. You have to speak your first language in hushed tones. You have to watch out for the police so you don't go out at night. Go out to work, come home, and that's it. And your employer? Well, they have to register you with Social Security, but as an illegal immigrant, you're not allowed to claim a refund. So you pay taxes, but get nothing.
Ay, no, esto está tenaz, Ustedes saben que mi esposo, que es mexicano, lleva muchos años viviendo acá. Y es una historia real, muy triste, muy triste. Obviamente las circunstancias en las que cruzó, ustedes saben, todos buscando un mejor futuro. Y es una realidad muy triste. Obviamente está ya por 17 años. Claro, estamos en el proceso de solucionar la cuestión migratoria, pero imagínense, 17 años pagándole impuestos al gobierno y nunca les van a devolver nada de eso. Y son miles al año que se tienen que pagar, miles. Y no solo eso, lo que él dice es cierto. Es del trabajo a la casa al trabajo. Primero porque no hay tiempo para vida social y segundo porque, claro, viven con miedo de que en cualquier momento puedan ser deportados. O sea, tenaz.
Think about another group of illegal immigrants. Digital nomads who come here on a tourist visa and then do profitable activities, which are taxable. Are any of them paying taxes to the Mexican government? Are any of them staying at home at night, not going out, not speaking English because they don't want to be caught and deported? Mm-hmm. Why is it that when Mexicans come to our country, they have to be on their best behavior at all times? But we think that being in a foreign country is a license to misbehave. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not making this video to say, don't come here or go back where you came from, gringo, because that's simply not going to happen. The material conditions that convince me to stay here are the same conditions that are convincing lots and lots more people to come here. And also, once you get here, life happens. I married a Mexican woman. We got 3 kids together. My future is here. And I'm sure a lot of other Americans feel the same way. Ooh. What I want to close this video with is just a little bit of advice from me, an immigrant, to you, fellow immigrants, about how to be a better guest in this country. Fellow immigrants. The first step, and it's something I've talked about a lot, is learning. Learn Spanish, learn about U.S. interventions in Mexico, learn the metric system. When you're out walking and you see a street named after some guy, find out who that guy is. You got a phone in your pocket, you can type in his name. Learn about the pre-Hispanic traditions in Mexico too and the different pre-Hispanic peoples. It's gonna be really embarrassing if you go all the way to Chichen Itza just to call it Aztec. It's not. The next step is humility. And this really comes down to financial things. Your dollars do not make you better than anyone here. You do not get to pretend that you are on spring break forever because you have more money. The other thing about this is that back in the US, we have that weird toxic culture of the customer is always right. That doesn't exist here. You can't abuse service workers. I see Americans do it all the time, and it's embarrassing. Learn to treat people like people. More on that note, it is a bad look to complain loudly about the things you don't like in Mexico. If you really hate the spicy food or the hot weather or the loud music so much, then why are you here? Nobody's forcing you to be here. You really can't expect Mexico to change just because you're here. You're not the main character. The final step, and this might be a hard one for some of you, is to leave the bubble. Any of these expat bubbles, in Roma Norte, Sayulita, wherever you want, why do you think they exist? Why is there this community of all foreigners in the most expensive part of town? Well, it's because Mexican capitalists saw the trend of Americans moving here, so they kicked the Mexican working class people out of those places so they could sell them at prices that only an American earning dollars could afford.
Si escucharon esa parte, Si escucharon esa parte, las personas que vivían ahí, los mexicanos que vivían en esas zonas turísticas llamativas, bonitas, llenas de todo este paisaje, esos lugares bonitos, fueron desplazados para poder compraron esas áreas y ahora las están vendiendo a valores que solamente personas con dólares pueden comprar. O sea, eso es un punto complejo.
But it really destroys this whole, we're helping the economy by bringing dollars down here. What that money's actually doing is making everything harder for Mexican working class people, and it all winds up in the pockets of just a few property owners. My advice, don't participate in it. There's no rule that says because you're from the US, you must live in one of these bubbles surrounded exclusively by other foreigners and paying 3 to 4 times more what you would pay anywhere else. I think a lot of people do this because they show up and they're not comfortable speaking Spanish, so they go with what's easiest. But if you learn just enough Spanish to get out of the bubble, you're gonna actually get to experience Mexico, and not just a gringo-themed Disneyland with gluten-free muffins. One final thought to close out the video. Our home country, the United States of America, it's not a normal country. One of the last surviving settler colonialist projects in the world. Especially since the end of the Cold War and what they called the end of history in 1991, the US has had a free hand to dominate absolutely everywhere on the globe that it wants. And people have been watching that internationally. They haven't been getting the propaganda that we got in schools about American exceptionalism and how everyone in the world wants to come to America, and even inside a Mexican or an Iraqi or whoever else we're invading that week, there's an American dying to be born, dying to forget his language and learn English. None of that is true. You have to stop thinking that you come from a special place and realize that the place you come from is unpopular in most of the world, and it's for a pretty good reason. When we talk about decolonization of things like the curriculum at school, it really has to start with us as individuals. You need to decolonize your thinking, your actions, and your existence, or you're just gonna wind up repeating all of these same patterns of subjugation and degradation. You might think, oh, well, I'm not a soldier coming down here with a gun. Yeah, but you don't need to be. You can still wind up perpetuating all of these same problems just by refusing to learn. And with that, we've officially ended the English portion of this video. Entonces, a todos mis seguidores que vieron todo esto leyendo los subtítulos, muchas gracias por ver. Y un gracias especial a estas personas bonitas que me siguen apoyando en Patreon. A pesar de que estoy tardando bastante con el video sobre la CIA y cocaína. Pero ya vienen. Nomás quería hacer esto primero porque es más fácil. Son básicamente opiniones y aparte lo pude grabar en inglés. Bueno, muchas gracias y espero un video bastante pronto, pero ya no les quiero decir exactamente cuándo porque luego les quedo mal. ¡Nos vemos! Hola,
Ay, no, de verdad que me he quedado impresionada de tan buen contenido que nos ha dado este joven. Dijo muchas cosas ciertas, me gusta cómo habla las cosas con verdad y les dicen, no crean que ustedes son especiales porque creen que vienen de un lugar especial donde se les ha montado una propaganda de que todo el mundo quiere ir allá y hablar allá el idioma y vivir la vida de ensueño, porque no es así. Porque el mundo es mucho más allá de eso. Claro, yo estoy muy agradecida con este país, porque si lo comparo con mi país, Colombia, que lastimosamente ha sufrido de invasión, de robo de recursos, de corrupción, de drogas, de violencia, pues claro, obviamente las condiciones van a ser buenas y pues al fin y al cabo el destino y la oportunidad de la vida me permite estar acá. Es un país que, repito, sí me abrió las puertas, pude revalidar mi carrera acá, puedo trabajar en lo que estudié. No es fácil tampoco el proceso para el inmigrante, sea como sea, pero como repito, sí, vivo una mejor vida que la que puedo vivir allá en Colombia y se le agradece a la gente pues de a pie que está igual que de uno, pues digamos que no tienen nada que ver en este asunto. Estamos hablando como siempre de las decisiones de los que toman los que están arriba y realmente hacen las cosas. Pero lo que él dice aquí es, ustedes, estadounidenses que vienen a vivir a México, primero no se crean tan importantes porque no lo son, salgan de la burbuja en la que viven, aprendan el idioma, porque si van a vivir en México, pues aprendan el idioma, valoren la cultura, aprendan, métanse dentro de todo, dentro de la comida, la historia, los lugares. Y segundo, pues no hagan lo de colocar estas zonas de una manera más costosa porque esto afecta a la economía de las personas que están en México, que viven en México, que han trabajado toda su vida en México. La verdad es que me quedo impresionada con todas estas palabras. Me gusta mucho su contenido. Wow, vamos a seguirlo viendo por acá. ¿Qué otro videito me aconsejan? Así que bueno, creo que la mayoría de los comentarios las hice durante el video y me quedo así como, oh, wow, hasta tiene su esposa mexicana y todo, me encanta. Así que mis queridos, recuerden que si quieren apoyar, dejen ese like, suscríbanse al canal, activen la campanita, nos vemos en mis otras redes sociales. Mi frase favorita ha llegado: mi corazón es mexicano, mi sangre colombiana. Nos vemos en un próximo video. Chaito, chaito.